The Electrocoin Duet cabinet was released in early 1991, especially to cater for the popularity of Street Fighter II. It was quite common to see multiple copies of Street Fighter II in these arcade cabinets, but in 1991 the game itself was pretty difficult to get hold of. Street Fighter II was a global arcade phenomenon, and definitely a British arcade phenomenon, and this game completely redefined the British amusement arcade, once more making the amusement arcade the place to go in order to play video games after quite a few years of slow decline. The game was distributed by London-based company Electrocoin, and suddenly arcades were full of players and we'd all be playing as Zangief or Ken or Ryu or E Honda or any of the other characters, and we'd be up against M. Bison and Sagat and Vega and Balrog and the whole Shadaloo organisation. In Street Fighter II you learned complex joystick and button commands in order to do different kinds of acrobatic fighting moves. Unlike many other arcade video games, Street Fighter II was directly competitive. You'd go toe-to-toe with other players or against the computer, and it created a really highly competitive experience in the arcade. Now, piracy and copies of Street Fighter II became rife, with unofficial game boards becoming available, and fairly soon afterwards unofficial modified versions of the game, such as the Black Belt edition, or my favourite, Rainbow edition. They began to appear in chip shops, cafes, and even sometimes in the odd arcade. Now, as an adolescent boy, Street Fighter II was everywhere. I'd play it in the arcade, I'd play it at home on my Nintendo SNES, I'd play it in the chip shops when I was at school, I'd play it in the cafe after school. The idea is that Street Fighter II became a really important touch point for adolescent youth. We'd each develop our own fighting styles and favourite characters. Of course, many other games followed Street Fighter II in its template. We had Mortal Kombat, Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, and loads of other competitors. But Street Fighter II is the one that really established that fighting genre. You might not realise it, but I absolutely love Street Fighter II, and I'd happily go toe-to-toe with anyone right now on it, although I might not win. Double Dragon was released in 1987 by Technos Japan, and I think probably the best way to think about this game is seeing it as Final Fight's big brother. In Double Dragon, the brothers Billy Lee and Jimmy Lee fight their way into a gang's headquarters to rescue Billy's girlfriend. One great thing about Double Dragon though is that even though it was a collaborative game where you were cooperating, you were also able to accidentally punch each other or kick each other along the way, or maybe even accidentally hit the other player with a baseball bat. So it would be great fun to be battling the other gang and then do a sneaky punch to the person that you're playing with. And players soon learned that elbow smashes were one of the very best moves you could do in the game, and good players could get really far in it, especially when playing with a friend. But, once again, I wasn't really any good at Double Dragon. There's a point in the second level or third level where you have to jump over a hole in a bridge, and I could just never do it. I'd always fall down the hole into the water and lose my credits. Now, Double Dragon was iconic, and it stayed in the arcade long after it was released, and it still remains a popular game to this day. But let's be clear, the best thing about Double Dragon was definitely beating up your friend instead of defeating the enemies. Golden Axe was a great fantasy-themed beat-em-up designed by Sega in 1989. In it you pick from Barbarian, Valkyrie and Dwarf, and much like Double Dragon or Final Fight, work your way from left to right beating up baddies. In this case, these baddies are skeletons, ogres, robbers and demons, and sometimes you'd get on top of a dragon and ride it around and use powerful magic. It was a great two-player game and had some excellent visual effects. However, the arcade game was soon ported onto home computers and the Sega Mega Drive, and while the arcade game was good, the home computer game was generally very well made. I sometimes played Golden Axe in the arcade, but if I'm honest, I preferred to play it around my friend's house, as the arcade situation just didn't add very much to the experience for me. It was a collaborative game, at times quite a difficult game, and there was little fun playing it alone or with someone that you didn't know who might not know the game or be communicative. In other words, it made more sense for us to play it on the Mega Drive. Many people suggested that home video games killed arcades. Now, I don't really think that's the case, or perhaps this is just a bit too simplistic, but I guess that Golden Axe is an example of this starting to happen. The game was good, the home game was almost just as good, and the game experience was enhanced by playing it at home with a friend. Other games, such as the big driving cabs like Outrun, those that were technical spectacles, or those where the random competitive nature of other players in the arcade, such as in Street Fighter 2, helped, well, they were suited to the arcade. But those without those features just work better at home. I'd still play Golden Axe in the arcade, using the skills that I developed at people's houses, but I'd not play it as much as the games that offered something really different. Pac-Land was another game that stayed a feature of the arcade long after other games made at the similar time had been replaced by others. It was conspicuous in my arcade as a game that my sister and her female friends, and many other female arcade visitors, used to play, alongside Nemesis and Wonder Boy. Pac-Land, made by Namco in 1984, takes the titular hero from the older top-down Pac-Man game and turns it into a side-scrolling platformer where Pac-Man explores a town, does some platforming over some rapids, and much like the older game, must avoid ghosts. That is, right up until a power pill is picked up and then Pac-Man can just gobble those ghosts up. Not only were my sister and the other girls often playing the game, using the in-game secrets that gave power-ups like the blue hard hat that protects Pac-Man from projectiles, but there'd almost always be a packet of cigarettes put on top of the machine, an Electrocoin Goliath cabinet in this case. The girls would arrive, light up a cigarette, put the white and purple box and clipper lighter on top of the machine, and then they'd begin to play the game. The presence of cigarettes, and the glancing accidental cigarette burns when he squeezed in next to another player were a very common arcade experience. We'd mostly keep to ourselves in the arcade, my sister with her friends and me with mine, but there were some points of recognition, where perhaps she'd check in on me, we might borrow some money off each other, say where we were going later, or more than once or twice my sister would go over and sort out a tough kid a year or two older than me, if they were being leery. Pac-Land was a great game, but it served as a meeting point in the arcade, and especially for female players. By this point in the arcade, Paperboy was an old game. Paperboy was released by Atari in 1984 and had a distinctive arcade cabinet that used BMX handlebars for controls. In Paperboy, you ride along a street throwing newspapers at post boxes or windows or dogs, all the while avoiding the different obstacles that get in your way. And now, even though Paperboy was an old game, it still remained popular and was one of the golden era arcade machines that hung around the British arcade. You'd still find Paperboy long after it had been released, hidden in the back of an arcade, but I think it still continued to make money because it was still a popular game. Now, Paperboy was one of the games that my sister would play with her friends, but it was never really quite enough for me. Games like this were often on 10p play, and sometimes if you wanted to try something different you'd play on them. But I guess that they were mostly there because they made sense. By this I mean someone can look at the controls, look at the BMX handlebars, and they'd know how the game kind of works. So someone who was unfamiliar would understand this game and then they would play it. Here we find Capcom's 1989 Final Fight on an Electrocoin Duet arcade cabinet. Final Fight is an excellent beat-em-up game where you pick one of the 3 different characters available: Mike Hagar, who is the mayor of Metro City, Cody and Guy, and then you go and beat up members of the Mad Gear gang in order to try and save Hagar's daughter and Cody's girlfriend. In Final Fight you walk around Metro City picking up pipes and bars and knives, and you basically just beat every baddie up. This is again an absolute classic Japanese beat-em-up of the time, and Capcom became a really important developer from this point forwards. And my days in the arcade were often spent playing Final Fight or sitting and watching other people play Final Fight. It's quite important to point out the sound design of the game as well. Not the sound design while you're playing it necessarily, but the sounds that came out of it when it was inviting you to play. The laughing of the Mad Gear members in the arcade game's attract mode used to reverberate around the arcade, and you knew that Final Fight was there just waiting for you to put a credit in. Battlezone, released in 1980 by Atari, was another golden age arcade machine that you still sometimes saw in the late 80s and 90s arcades. While many of the arcade games that I played on made use of the Japanese jammer standard, a way that new games could easily be inserted into older arcade machines, a bit like cartridges in a games console, instead of jammer cabs, golden era video games like Battlezone had dedicated hardware and combined physical cabinet, control panel and game. After they became less popular, some machines like this might get converted into a newer game. Perhaps the artwork and control panel would be painted over and tinkered with. But for something like Battlezone, with its weird joysticks, the machine was just simply too oddly shaped to get this kind of change to work. In Battlezone, you pilot a tank using 2 joysticks and you shoot opponents in vector graphic 3D. And it's a good game, but it wasn't popular with the local arcade fans where I lived. I guess nobody felt that comfortable playing a game where you couldn't see what was going on around you, but who knows? Golden Age games like Battlezone or Paperboy made up a part of almost every British amusement arcade's machine mix. They just made a smaller and smaller portion of it every single year. Instead, arcade fans of my era developed an appetite for cabinets that could be used to play almost any game, these jammer cabinets, such as the Electrocoin Goliaths, Centis or Duets, or Europa Coin Silver Stars. These jammer cabs were my bread and butter, and you look forward to seeing what games would be installed on them in your next arcade visit. Here we have the 1988 Capcom classic game Ghouls and Ghosts. This was distributed by Electrocoin in the UK, and if you take a look up at the Electrocoin made marquee, the lit up strip at the top of the machine, you'll spot a spelling mistake. It's the sequel to Ghosts and Goblins and sees you taking the role of Sir Arthur, who must battle the armies of darkness to save his princess's soul. This meant working from left to right, platforming, and using all kinds of medieval and magical weapons to destroy skeletons, shaman, imps, demons and ogres. Ghouls and Ghosts was really difficult. With one hit you'd lose all your armour and just be left there standing in your underpants, and then with another hit you'd be dead. But despite this, or perhaps because of it, Ghouls and Ghosts was a great game to play. Nemesis, known elsewhere as Gradius, was another one of the games in the arcade that I wasn't that bothered about, but it had become a mark of quality and video game skill for the group of arcade visitors that was my sister and her friends, 4 years older than me. I was just a little kid, but my sister's mates seemed like men and women. This was even more so as the arcade was sometimes a meeting place for the local adolescent gang, the Broadstairs Posse, and occasionally was visited by emissaries from the neighbouring Margate Casuals and Ramsgate Casuals. They adopted some of the naming, and the tendency towards punch-ups, with football hooligans, but they were generally nice kids. For whatever reason, Nemesis was one of the games that they all played, and so I connected Nemesis with tough kids. I found the game really difficult, and therefore I wasn't that bothered about it. There wasn't any problem if other people played on the machine, but what was interesting was that these older kids played a few games like Nemesis. They often met at the machine, they cared about the high scores, and they used them almost like calling cards. And also, they didn't seem to play many of the newer games that I liked. They also seemed to care more about the high score tables than the younger kids did, and I sometimes wondered if this was to do with the ways that the culture of the arcade changed in even a few years. What can I say about Atari's 1983 Star Wars arcade cabinet? The sit-down arcade machine was iconic, seen everywhere throughout the British arcade. It had fantastic vector graphics, and it let you fly through the Star Wars trench run, shooting TIE fighters and eventually blowing up the Death Star. Now, even though the film was pretty old at this point, the game was absolutely fantastic. Atari manufactured more than 12,000 of these machines, and in Britain it was distributed by a company called Associated Leisure, with a deal negotiated by a chap called Colin Mallory. Interestingly, Colin wasn't exactly convinced by the game when he visited the special trade event, but because it was a glitzy American affair, he took his family with him. His daughter loved the Star Wars game and convinced Colin that Star Wars was the right machine for the British audience, and it sold in huge numbers, seen in almost every single arcade. Now, while the game was great, it was one of those machines that were just fun to sit in, even when you didn't have any money, and it was pretty common to find kids sitting in the cabs and just pretending to play. The game was made all the better for the digitised voice samples from the film, but by the late 1980s it wouldn't have been a huge earner, but still remained a reliable feature of the arcade, often tucked away in the back of an arcade, or in this case, in a corner by the entrance.